Problematizing the language and dialect distinction. Now, while it might be sort of clear to you, or you might have some assumptions about what a language is and what a dialect is, however, it is time now to challenge the assumptions that you have. So, the distinction between a language and a dialect is often made on the basis of size and prestige. Let us look at this question of size first. So what we are saying is that languages are larger, that is, they have more linguistic items than dialects do. So that is the reason we call one variety a language, and we are saying that the other other variety is actually a dialect and not language. So we will say English is a language, while Texan English, Yorkshire English, all of these are dialects of English. Now, what is the problem? We will come back to it a little later. The second thing that we look at and is usually used to describe what a language or to distinguish language from a dialect is prestige. So we say somehow a language has more prestige, a higher status than a dialect. So how do we determine this prestige? We determine this because by looking at institutional support offered to languages in comparison to dialects. So you would see that the language that is being used, for instance, in Khabarnama is a language and it's not a dialect because it is a standard language that is being promoted by virtue of its use in schools, in governments, functioning, and also in media. All right. And we say that that is why it has a higher sort of status. Now, there are several contradictions between them also, that is, between the question of size and this criterion of prestige. For instance, let us take the example of standard English, that is the Queen's English, and this is how it is known. So your BBC, the language that it uses is the standard English, and we say that it has a certain kind of prestige. Now, if it passes the standard of prestige, the problem of size remains there, because this standard English, strictly speaking, from the point of size, should be a dialect, because it is not using all the vocabulary used in other dialects. It does not derive from it, and it is somehow of a shorter variety than the different dialects of English have within them. Remember, calling a language or standardizing a language as a language is a direct and deliberate process. So when the institutions choose a language as the standard language, it is nothing inherent in the language, but it has been the work of institutions. It has been a deliberate choice by which you call something or call a variety a standard language. For instance, let's also talk about size again on this distinction between language and dialect. If you look at this language, Luxembourgish, which is a language of Luxembourg constitutionally, But if you study it linguistically in terms of the linguistic items it has, it turns out to be a Rhennish dialect. And this Rhennish dialect that we call dialect would appear to be a language. So it is a political decision regarding what we call a language. Similarly, when we talk about prestige, please remember that even some dialects, and there is work being done in European institutions where certain dialects have been given a lot of status and work is being done on it. So the question is that do these dialects remain dialects then once they get the status, or would we call them languages now? Similarly, when we say something that differentiates a language from dialect is the criteria of, for instance, intelligibility. We would say, for instance, that if people using a language or two languages are not able to understand each other, that means they are using different languages. But when they can understand what is being said, then that means that these two people are using the dialect of the same language. However, even this definition is problematic because in Chinese, the difference that we make between certain languages, they are what we call these are the dialects of Chinese. These are not mutually intelligible. That is, people will not be able to understand each other. Interestingly, there are some varieties that we call languages. For instance, Danish, Swedish, Norwegian. And yet these languages are mutually intelligible. That is, speaker of either one of these languages will be able to understand them. So what we are saying is that this distinction between language and dialect is arbitrary. Standardized language is a deliberate act, and very often if a language is subordinate to a single standard, we call it a dialect of that language. Mutual intelligibility, when we talk about understanding the language, then even it is more perceptual. And the question also comes that how much one person actually wants to understand the other person. So the main thing that is at work over here between language and dialect is the power distinction. It is a political decision.